Hello, a big welcome back to all of you that have been joining us throughout the day. This is the final session of Identify 2021, and a hello to those people who perhaps are joining us for the first time. It's good that you're with us. So thank you for attending 2021 Identify and making it such a lively and interactive summit. A reminder of some housekeeping points. You will have plenty of opportunity to ask questions during our live session, during the Q&A session. You can submit questions and queries to us outside of the live session using the email inquiry@goodintelligence.com. We'll get through as many questions as we can, but also make sure we run this session smoothly and follow up afterwards. Keep a watch out for messages on our social channels, including Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm delighted to be joined by Sanjay Gupta, VP, Global Head of Product and Corporate Development at Mitek, for our Fireside Chat today. We're going to be discussing fraud biometrics and the identity lifecycle. Welcome, Sanjay.
Thanks, Alan. Great to be here.
Could you please kind of tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your role at Mitek, please?
Sure. I've been at Mitek for coming around 5 years, actually, next month. And in that process, I've been here, originally joined to help the company grow inorganically through technology partnerships and alliances. And then a couple of years into the journey, I also took over running the products team. So in that time period, we acquired 3 companies. So early on, there was a company we acquired in Barcelona, and then another company in Paris. So basically, I carry those 2 hats. Additionally, we have a very large agent team. It's about 125 agents that we use for when a document can't be adjudicated by the auto system, it gets escalated to the agents. So that team also I kind of manage.
Okay, fantastic. Earlier on in my initial kind of keynote presentation, I mentioned about how active the identity market is at the moment. We've seen close to $1 billion worth of investment so far and we're only in June 2021. So, and I've heard a lot about recent acquisitions at Mitek. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and leading to the kind of your strategic kind of strategy for Mitek, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So recently we announced an acquisition of a company that was our partner for over 2 years. The name of the company is ID R&D. So if you look at what Mitek does today, we offer a product, an identity proofing product, whereby the end consumer can take a picture of their ID front and back, and also a selfie. Now the selfie is a very, very critical component to this process. When we have the selfie, we actually send it to our server, and that's where the ID R&D product was running. Basically allows us to determine whether that individual was live at the time when they're trying to do the transaction. So they could check to see if hey, was this a photo of the person, or was this a person on a video, or maybe somebody wearing a mask trying to try to become an imposter, right? To get this identity document and system kind of onboarded and maybe cause havoc down the road. But additionally, we run a lot of other checks on the document, so it's not just checking the selfie to the photo at the end of it. So we felt that this was critically important on a go-forward basis, and we wanted to bring this piece of technology and have it under our control so we can use it for other purposes throughout the life cycle of that particular identity.
Yeah, and from our point of view and from our research, because we're very active in the space as an analyst firm, we're seeing the increasing importance of liveness detection, and believe that there are a few kind of vendors who actually do it right. We've been we've known ID R&D for many years ourselves, so I think it's a good acquisition, and it means that you can you have that advantage perhaps in terms of owning that kind of technology yourselves.
Definitely, a lot of our competitors also use ID R&D's
Sure.
based on liveness, and so our position is that we have competition. Obviously, we're trying to all compete for share of wallet, but the reality is that we're all fighting fraud. So if our competitors or other companies can use this piece of technology to fight fraud together, then we should do it. Additionally, to your point, ID has a second bimodal, biometric that's important, is really around the voice. So on the voice, to have a complete solution, so you can capture the voice and then determine if that person's voice is live during the time when they're either onboarding or trying to do an authentication event, and then be able to match the voice. The matching of the voice is not through natural language processing. It's really through looking at a feature vector that you're comparing the original voice, the onboarded voice, to the one that's being submitted at the time of transaction. And to your point, what's critically important throughout this whole process is the fact that you want to do it where it's really imperceptible to the end user. So they're not doing something where they're being asked to do something unnatural, blink, move your head side to side, or do something that's not really representative of a natural engagement. So we also think that face, with a combination of voice, if used properly, is just the way we speak as humans, and allowing that natural extension of the journey for the consumer is really, really critically important.
Yeah, and that seems to be a natural way of ensuring that you've got good conversion rates, because you don't want people abandoning that onboarding process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you say Mitek exists to help eliminate fraud, making the internet a safe place to interact. So how does the acquisition help Mitek in that goal?
So I think kind of helping us from the perspective of adding another biometric, but additionally, we want to kind of migrate from the original onboarding to some other event that's within the life cycle. So in fact, if you want, I can share a slide with you, which might help to explain this a little bit further, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good idea. Thank you.
Let's see. Can you see my slide?
Yep. If you want to.
I'm only going to use this one slide.
That's perfect. Yeah.
So if we think about where we are in companies like us, it's really around this identity proofing event that occurs at the very beginning of the engagement, where you onboard an individual. And then, for the longest time, even at Mitek, we kind of forgot or didn't really analyze, well, what happens to that consumer once they've been onboarded? So if you're at a bank, right, obviously, once you onboard the individual, you're going to give them some sort of account, and that account is going to be used by the user to do certain things. But that means that you have to provide authentication to the account. So either, a username and password. And in the past, password was typically just, a 6-digit code, but more and more you can use the biometric. So our hypothesis is that if you can capture the biometric at the identity proofing point of view, could you reuse that biometric to allow them to do authentication? Now, obviously, not every single consumer is going to get the same level of account access in terms of things that they can do in the account. Maybe they can only do checking initially, but then later on they get authorized to do, maybe have a savings account or potentially apply for a credit card. So that's really around authorization. And then somewhere along the journey, you'll notice that, hey, consumers potentially get locked out of their account, whether they forget their password, or if the institution is trying to protect that consumer from a account takeover, then that individual has to go back and re-verify themselves. So really the question they're trying to answer is, hey, is this still you? Are you still the owner of the account? And then it kind of continues that journey. So what we're finding is that elements of pieces that we can pick up at the beginning from identity proofing, we could potentially reuse this throughout the customer lifecycle that we're depicting here.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of the re-verification, what scenarios would prompt that? You mentioned kind of kind of losing credentials, etc., changing phones, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a bunch of them. So if you think about, hey, I've locked myself out because I forgot my password, that potentially could be a re-verification event. What if I wanted to add a new device to my account? So again, you might have to re-verify yourself. So those are situations where the consumer themselves have done something to create this event to occur. But there are other times where, from a regulatory perspective, we're hearing more and more that potentially, well, account owner, you may have to provide your documentation that you use at origination, maybe once or twice a year, to confirm that the identity is still the same. Or let's say if your identity document was expired, that may also trigger an event. Another one that's really interesting is an account takeover, where the institution has, for some reason, has realized that maybe a unauthorized individual has gotten into the account, and so to protect the account's assets for that consumer, they lock them out, and then the consumer has to come back and again re-verify themselves to say, no, this is really me, and they could change a credential and kind of go forward. So I mean, there are other events that could occur, but those are typically the ones that that we're seeing.
So there's a lot of relationships here. So, I can think of risk-based authentication, having a kind of an engine to kind of make that decision in terms of when they need to re-verify or when they need to kind of step up, for instance. And then there's fraud management systems for the kind of the suspicious activity. How do you manage that? Do you own that relationship? Do you own those, or do you offer kind of, interfaces into existing systems that an organization may have?
Yeah, so we at Mitek, we don't own this whole life cycle, right? But we believe that these are really the critical components that that an institution consider when they're designing their system. So what we're trying to do is provide different pieces of the puzzle to make that happen for them. From your perspective, right? Yeah, you're right. From a risk-based perspective, the institution is going to have a lot more signals that we could offer at Mitek to determine, hey, what level of risk are you coming into the circle or being within the circle? And what's also interesting is when you consider fraud is really different from identity proofing versus when you're in the circle, right? When you're identity proofing, you're trying to weed out the bad actors, saying that, hey, this person doesn't own the account because they may be trying to do money laundering, something different. Whereas when you're in the circle, you're actually protecting the consumer's assets, and you're making sure that the unauthorized access can't occur. But we're not saying at Mitek we do everything, but we try to look at it holistically and determine where can Mitek play and help the institution, provide a better service.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense to kind of do it this way. It's a vision, definitely. I think it's where the industry is moving to, and I think there's from our relationships with the users, the buyers of this technology, there seems to be an appetite to manage identity, fraud, authorization, authentication in perhaps a much better connected way. So yeah, I can concur from an analyst point of view that this vision makes a hell of a lot of sense. So we hear a lot about biometrics and trust signals in the initial onboarding process. So how does Mitek look to new revenue streams? Is it more technology layers or new ways to use identity proofing?
So if I just stick to the slide for a second, it's really, again, looking at identity proofing, the signals that we're capturing there, and being able to reuse those signals. In the past, what we found is that we pretty much stuck to identity proofing and never really looked at the circle correctly. And so there are elements that could be reused, reapplied, again, like I said, for re-verification, for example, right? If you had already captured the individual's document, and let's say if we were maintaining it, or even the institution was maintaining it, then you could repurpose that and ask the consumer to resupply a document and then match it to what they initially used for onboarding. So from a revenue perspective, this is kind of where we see playing with the current solutions that we have available to us.
Yeah, definitely. That's useful. Thanks. So, Mitek is building out core technologies for enterprises, who take things seriously. On the surface, a lot of ID providers seem to be doing the same thing. So how do you differentiate yourselves from competitors?
Yeah, let me stop sharing. So basically, I think we probably have three different things that are different for us. So first of all, today we're the only publicly traded company in the sector from the perspective of a company that's providing identity proofing. With that comes a lot of compliances, right? So we have to provide financial statements to the SEC on a quarterly basis. We have a director of compliance for internal auditing to ensure that the data that we're retaining has a life cycle, that it's deleted according to the contracts that we have in place. And then that transparency is really important to our banking customers, because they want to be able to look at that and say, oh, okay, yep, Mitek is doing what they're saying, and have all this data and reports available to them. So those are probably the couple of things there. The other thing I can tell you is that our customer success team is critically important for our end customers, because identity proofing solutions like this are actually extremely complicated. So it's not just that you install this and you walk away. You have to continuously work with the customer to determine, well, how can I get another point, allowing more users through, right? And sometimes it means tweaking how their flow works, and working with them to ensure that they understand the results properly. So our customer success team is tied not only at the point of onboarding that new customer, but throughout the journey of, and we typically have quarterly to, every 6 weeks, we'll have meetings with them to go over the results to ensure that they understand that. And finally, I would say, if you look at our balance sheet, we have quite a bit of cash on hand, and we're going to, not only use the cash, but also our stock, deployed in a way that's meaningful to our customers, where we are picking up the right assets, bringing them onto the family portfolio of products that we have, and then deploy those in a way that that's meaningful and supports this journey that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think from an opinion point of view, I think that also that I think behavioral biometrics has got a big part to play in all this, from in the initial onboarding process. I think to weed out kind of attacks, kind of rats and bot attacks and synthetic identity, through to the going through into that transaction processing and authentication. So what is your opinion on the use of that technology, and what are you doing in this area?
That's a great question. So let me answer it maybe a little different way. When we look at Mitek's strategy, we typically think of it in 3 different horizons. So horizon 1 is really around improving our current product. Why? Well, fraudsters don't sleep, right? They're always constantly attacking our customer systems. If you think about our customer systems, they're live, right? Anybody could get onto the system and provide a lot of havoc there. So we're constantly monitoring those systems, and then looking at the fraud attack vectors, and improving our product from authentication perspective. But additionally, in every geo, there's always new documents that are coming out. And so maintaining those documents, not only through our agents, but through our auto system. So that's kind of horizon 1. Horizon 2 is really looking at the next adjacency, which is around authentication. And this is one of the reasons why we actually brought ID R&D into the portfolio. It allows us to extend that selfie, reuse that selfie potentially for authentication, and again, for reverification. Where I believe the future is, which is really horizon 3, is really around what you're talking about, is behavioral biometrics. And today, there are companies that are touting that maybe through 1 or 2 minimal of interactions with the consumer, let's say 2 to 3 times that you've seen the consumer, you can actually capture their behavior. Now, what I think is going to happen is that at the onset of onboarding, because the consumer is actually very interactive with the device, if you can capture that behavior and in a way make it portable and use that as another underlying layer to do authentication or something else that you want from a security perspective, then I think that's going to be very game changing. So these are areas that we're looking at today. We are looking at a couple of different companies that we want to partner with initially and try it out, and then see how we can take that on a go-forward basis. But somehow we want to extend the consumer's journey from initial onboarding and make it where it's really imperceptible to them that behavior has been captured and it's being used to help protect their accounts.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, especially with behavioral, it's that link into the user journey, user experience, frictionless. If I compare, identity verification and proofing from 3 years back and compare it to now, it's a much slicker kind of process. I don't have to, there's no blinking for the liveness, there's no holding the phone backwards and forwards to get that kind of perhaps kind of image processing as well. So it's it's that link into improving the customer experience. As again, if I repeat, that kind of ensuring that those conversion rates are good, while at the same time ensuring that rejection rates are kept low, and that's through accuracy. I think it's that evolution of the technology, I think. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, but since I got you, I want to ask you a question, because I know that you're an expert here on the regulations and stuff. So I'm curious, what do you see coming down the pipe here in terms of new regulations that we should be kind of aware of?
So we've just done a big study on looking at global regulation from a data protection and privacy point of view, applicable to biometrics, and in particular applicable to behavioral biometrics. And obviously GDPR is the gold standard here. It's the standard that has been attempted to be emulated throughout the world. So, and that has, and consent, the good measures for the collection, the storage, and processing of biometric data, and from GDPR as being replicated in places like Brazil, Mexico, Singapore, Australia, and with federal and state legislation in the US as well. You've got biometric legislation in Illinois, Washington State, and Texas.
TCPA in California.
TCPA, yeah. So that's a very good, and I think California is a big economy. So I think that if you want to operate, in the US, you got to comply. It's very similar with GDPR. If you want to, comply internationally, then GDPR is that kind of standard that you need to kind of adhere to. And I think from a principal point of view, it's good. Behavioral is a little bit of a grey area in terms of definition. Do you need the consent? Is it a static? It's not really it's very different from other biometric identifiers. So it's a very active. It's based on it. You can anonymize it as well. So there's been some case studies in Germany, which is one of the strictest kind of data protection privacy legislation in the world, and it's proved that behavioral biometrics it doesn't require consent. It's something that you can operate in a way that's applicable to GDPR. The future, and I think if you look at Europe as a kind of ahead in terms of state regulation, I think it's that the AI. So it's set up a consultation on the kind of the regulation of AI systems. It's very difficult. Obviously that affects a lot of technologies, but it also affects, you're talking about machine learning and AI for that decision-making process, for facial identification and liveness. So that's going to be that from a future point of view could have an effect on the way AI is designed. So based on non-bias, non-discriminatory, which is very important, and obviously privacy advocates around the world and in the US have been very, very vocal in terms of ensuring that you do not discriminate on skin tone or ethnicity or gender, and I think organizations that I speak to are very much on line in terms of ensuring that the data that they use to train their engines is ensuring that it's non-biased, etc. So I think AI is going to be, it's very, very tricky, because for instance, if you train your AI system, and there has been some cases in the US with facial recognition companies, if you train your AI engine based on data that may have been collected in a non-consent basis, and it creates an AI engine because of that, does that mean you have to then, and someone says, well, I disagree with that, and I want to take my my facial my facial image away from that, then there's an issue that perhaps you need to change the whole of the engine. So it affects. So there's a lot of knock-on effects, and I think that's going to be the next big one in terms of regulation. And it'll affect a lot of systems, not just in the identity and the biometric space.
I completely agree with you, Alan. I could tell you more and more recently, we've been getting requests for model risk management, where companies, especially the big banks, they're asking, hey, how does your algorithm actually work in terms of the response that it's getting, what data sets you're using? So what we've been doing, again, through our compliance director, we've been actually putting documentations out there already to kind of, don't wait for them to ask the question, give them the answer first and then control that conversation. And so we've not done that with a handful of banks, and it's been really effective to do that. But you're right. I mean, there's just so much, in some ways, kind of the wild, wild west, right? In terms of biometrics and what's been happening, and the confusion that it causes with consumers is pretty daunting. They don't know the difference between consent-based and, to your point, consent-based versus non-consent.
Yeah.
Used for surveillance, non-surveillance, and so that causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah, and is my data going to be sent somewhere else? Is the third party going to access the biometric data that has been collected for identification or verification or authentication? So there are legitimate concerns from a privacy and data protection point of view for this. So is there, obviously, carrying on from that, there isn't any standards related to kind of bias in AI and facial recognition at the moment, is there?
I mean, I wouldn't say they're standard. There are agencies, or let's say testing certification sites that will certify that it conforms to a certain level of standard in terms of recognition or in terms of comparison. You kind of hit it on the head, where the bias isn't in the algorithm, the bias is in the data that's being used to actually train the algorithm. So the more data that you have that's representative of the population that you're trying to actually, invoke, right? If you don't have, if that data is not geographically diverse and representative of the different scenarios that you're looking at, then you're going to train the engine incorrectly. So a lot of our issues here at Mitek, we tend to look at those data sets very, very closely, and to ensure that you don't, implicitly somehow cause a bias because, hey, you forgot a underrepresented sample or underrepresented race, for example. So
is there any activity at a federal level in terms of not on data protection, but on use of AI, in particular kind of bias?
There's been some, rumblings here, at least in the States, in the US, in regards to that, but nothing's really come out. It's been more, as you talked about, state to state, they've been looking at it and saying, well, can we at least protect the biometric of the individual, protect it for, the consent usage that individual said, versus, being able to use it for anything. So those are things that are very, very heavy here in the States. But again, I think there's just confusion between being used for surveillance purposes versus, hey, I'm going into my account that I own, right? And so that one-to-one check is very, very, a lot easier of a use case versus a one-to-end kind of match.
And that's been a concern for some of the specific biometric regulation, perhaps, that we see in Illinois and Texas, is that it's a potential that it could be used against verification and authentication systems, in addition to be used in those surveillance situations. So okay. So we're up to the hour mark here. Is there any kind of final remarks, comments that you'd like to make to our audience today?
I think in general, at Mitek, we're always trying to be a step ahead of what's happening in the marketplace. So the idea that we're going to be reusing this biometric for other parts of the journey is something we really started 4.5 years ago, right? In terms of being able to look at the selfie, and we went through this exercise of active liveness to passive liveness to get it to the point where we are today. So just like that, we have other things that we're working on. This whole idea around fraud, right? When a person opens an account today, fraud is not committed at that point. Fraud usually occurs 3, 6, 9 months later, and there could be different elements of it. And so what we're trying to do is trying to stay step ahead, and we're looking at being able to not only at time T0 when the person onboards, but maybe using that biometric and the biodata to look at other events that are occurring through other tenants to see if that same information has been used incorrectly to open up another account. So these are things that, you know, we don't typically talk about. We talk about them with customers very closely, but later this month, actually early next month, July, we're going to be starting to release some of our products based on catching fraud from a different perspective. So it's kind of a time series, if you will. So innovation, it's like I said earlier, is that fraudsters don't sit, right? They're always innovating. They're very creative people, and you have to have a lot of respect for them. And in that sense, you have to actually understand their behavior and try to figure out how are you going to catch them. So this is a cat and mouse game for us.
Sure.
So we're all continuously innovating around that.
Yeah, and it comes back to threat intelligence and understanding the kind of the tools that they're using, and that's very important. So that's a kind of a lesson to be learned from the cybersecurity industry, you know, in terms of and that crossover into, you know, identity and authentication. Yeah, I can understand it. Well, from an analyst point of view, I think you got it spot on. I think, you know, thanks for sharing your vision today with us, Sanjay. I think it's I think you got it right, and I think the acquisitions that you have made, including ID&R, are very commendable, and will ensure that, you know, that the product it will prove popular. So thank you, Sanjay, for your time today. That brings the Good Intelligence Identify Summit 2021 to a close. Thank you to all our speakers and panelists today for joining us and sharing their insight and expertise. Thank you to all of you that has tuned into today's summit. I hope that you've taken away something of value from today's event. If we didn't manage to get round to answering your questions, we should be following up with them to ensure that you get an answer. And the recording from this particular session and all the sessions throughout the summit will be available shortly, and we'll be in touch with the details in how to access this recording. On that note, I'd like to thank you for all attending. Look out for future events from us, and we have a packed agenda for the remaining months of 2021. Stay safe and well. Thank you.